Welcome to the Birds and Nerds podcast. In each episode, I explore a topic that I want to learn more about with an expert in that field. Somehow, we always find the connection, sometimes unexpected, to my favorite animals, birds. AI is a growing part of all of our lives, so today we're looking at who is in charge, making sure that AI is being used for us and not against us. And we're talking about how we might be able to use AI to learn more about birds by speaking directly to birds. Wouldn't that be cool? My nerd today is Vilas Dhar, president of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation and a leading global voice on equity in a tech-enabled world. I'm Ramona Schindelheim. This is Birds and Nerds. Vilas, thank you for joining me on Birds and Nerds. We're going to do the nerdy part first. We're going to talk about AI, and you always help me understand where we're at in AI as a society better than anyone I know. So I appreciate that. We'll get to the birds a little bit later, but it is related to AI. So first, where are we at in the adaptation and adoption of AI?
Well, Ramona, I want to tell you, I want to get to the birds as soon as possible, and I'm always a nerd. I love this invitation and this podcast. You asked a question, where are we with AI? And I almost think that we're in the 5 stages of grief of AI. What do I mean by that? I think before ChatGPT, we were a very small set of experts that were thinking about AI, and the rest of the world almost denied that it meant something. It was so easy to say that speculation will never be in our world. And then something quite profound happened. In a period of just a few months, we started to see consumer AI become available, ChatGPT and its ilk. And it almost feels like the world swung the pendulum to the other side. We became so optimistic about AI that it felt like it would cure everything. I sat at the United Nations as a senior leader, and tech sat next to me and looked out at a group of world leaders and said, I know you think a lot about human rights, but AI will cure so many of these problems that it won't be as important. And I had to laugh that we could even have such an absurd statement.
I would almost cry.
Maybe I laughed because I didn't want to cry. But we've moved past it, I hope. We're now in a world where people have been scared. They've been scared of how AI might kill us all if you take the existential risk. But maybe more importantly and profoundly, how it might actually challenge our economic dignity and our health welfare. And then some anger about who is going to be making these decisions and making sure they represent us. But maybe finally, we're also coming to a place of pragmatic acceptance. No longer asking the question, can we or should we? But beginning to say, how do we use AI tools, hopefully, in ways that make the world a better place? Now, that sounds quite naive, and we can dig into that a little bit. I want to tell you first my positive vision for that future. We can come back to the rest. But what I will tell you is this: where in previous technological revolutions, new ideas were created and maybe decision makers said, I don't know if we're ready for that. AI feels quite different because now I hear from CEOs and from CTOs, from policymakers, from community leaders, we want it. We need to figure out how to make AI a part of the work that we do. And to me, that's quite hopeful.
I like that hopefulness, but I also have a little bit of trepidation myself, partly about the workers, but also about the people who are implementing it. You said, a few years ago, there were a handful of AI experts, people you've spent decades looking at this. Now everybody thinks they're an AI expert, and we don't even know what we have in front of us. How do you feel about that?
I think that's exactly right. And I think one of the most unfortunate things that's happened is the way that the headlines follow these proclamations or statements from technology entrepreneurs who don't limit their statements to technology, but often want to talk about economic structuring or about drug discovery or about any number of other topics that aren't part of their core discipline. The challenge I have with it is not what people might say, but rather in the ways that it shapes a public narrative that becomes about profit, that becomes about efficiency, that becomes about making decisions about American competitiveness or domination of the international realm, but fails to acknowledge the very basic truth that all of this transformation that's happening isn't just happening for a few people that have control of that technology. It's happening, unfortunately, to many, many billions of people on this planet. And I wonder why we don't have a conversation about how we shift that to a for, so a transformation that happens for people, and maybe much more profoundly, a transformation that happens by people. It means that we need to have a very different conversation. We'd no longer talk about the $500 billion that's been proposed to build a data center, to build an emergent and new form of AI, but rather a question about why there's such a vacuum of funding to create the translation of the AI we have today to use it to do things that actually makes people's lives better today and tomorrow. From building the translational AI that improves health outcomes, from investing in our educational systems, from really having a thoughtful conversation about how we structure our economy and the incredible and powerful role that workers have in shaping what this future should look like. If we could move to that conversation, that trepidation that you and I feel, it wouldn't go away. But maybe it would let us drive towards a more dynamic sense of a more inclusive future.
Do you feel or let me put it this way, in the centuries that technology has evolved, was it whether it was Ford and the assembly line that actually created more jobs in our country and actually starts back with the steam engine and even before with looms. I know a story about how the people who made cloth, when looms came around, they said, "Oh my gosh, we're out of work." But what it did was it made the demand bigger. So there were more jobs and now we make it's cheap to make, right? People make it very cheaply. But going back to this past century, the mass production of vehicles on the assembly line, it did create a lot of jobs. But then something like ATMs in banks, all the people who used to work behind the registers, the tellers, they left. But then the banks created new jobs with new products. So there is innovation. There's always innovation. The same with an iPhone, internet, all things you know. Where are we at now when it comes to that thoughtfulness that you think we need? And I agree with you. And the American worker and what AI might do to this generation.
I think you're framing up a very fundamental tension between two different approaches of thinking about the world. One is a short term view, one that says, how do we extract the most value as possible right now? The other is a long term view that says, how do we create value not just for ourselves, but for our society? Let me give you an example. An employer today or tomorrow might look at the broad spectrum of AI applications that are available out there and say, you know what? We could bring in a small suite of those, and I could take away an entire worker out of my workforce and save whatever we pay them a year. And that probably is what the market will incentivize for many companies and employers to say, look, take the shortcut. Use an AI tool, displace a worker, save yourself some money on the back end, and we'll all be great. And yet I wonder what happens to the positive economic value of having those workers who have such domain expertise, that have the ability to innovate, that say, you know what, the next widget could be 10% better if we just did X, Y, or Z. What about a different approach that said instead of cutting costs per worker, we said we want AI to improve productivity per worker. We want to actually think about how we maintain the same worker base or grow it. And we use AI tools to make sure that the people in those jobs are more productive. They do more of the value adding work, that human work, the work that requires care and empathy, imagination and creativity, job skills and wisdom. Now, we know that the market by itself won't really allow that, right? For a company to go out to its shareholders, its constituents, and say, we're going to take a longer, less efficient path to a better future requires a significant amount of trust. But Ramona, we also have policy levers that we could use to support this. What if we built new mechanisms to incentivize employers to increase productivity instead of cut costs? What if we created capital facilities that let employers say, we're going to do the R&D so that instead of making a decision today, we'll make it in 3 months. And we'll use that 3 months to really understand what the effects of AI-based involvement in our business could lead to. What if we said there were financing facilities that became a part of our political and economic structure that let employers experiment and take risks? What if we, and I'll give you an example, we let an employer who says, today I have 40 skilled workers that do a job, and tomorrow I might get pitched 40 robots that'll do those jobs. But if I wait, if I invest in the R&D, if I actually partner with a technology company, I could see a third way. One where I'm actually able to bring in some automation that still requires 40 workers, but gives me the productivity of 120 workers. Now, that might sound like an abstract, but it's based on a real example that I've just dealt with in a shipyard. These are the kinds of decisions that business leaders are facing today. And we need to make sure that they're incentivized to pick that third choice, one that protects American workers, but also protects our capacity to innovate in the marketplace, and one that provides a long-term economic sustainability future for our entire economy.
I would point out that if you could keep those 40 workers are paying taxes.
Absolutely.
They help support your local economy, your state and national economy. So, what do you propose Who should be involved? Who should be the we? We kind of talked about this in the past. Who should be the we who's setting those guardrails?
The challenge today, and let's start from the problem, is that the we is quite limited. And this has been true really since the era of the internet, is the concentration of technological power. The people, the compute, the data that drives these innovations means that those institutions have outsized voices in our public narrative and discourse. Think about the number of headlines that we've seen recently that, as I mentioned earlier, are some head of some tech company making a proclamation that sends shockwaves through the market. And yet there's no public accountability, there's no peer review, there's not even an assumption that data is driving those decisions. So I'll tell you, the problem today is we have policy being made that in many ways is representative of the interests of a very small set of players, technology companies, policymakers, and potentially some civil society and community groups that are in the conversation. I can't think of a world where I would be comfortable with the idea that we're making decisions that affect billions of people that are informed by maybe thousands or tens of thousands. So the starting point is building a new form of public literacy on these issues, investing in our schools and investing in public education campaigns, working with journalism and the media to ensure that we're telling full comprehensive stories about what's happening so that the average person doesn't just feel like this is a thing that's happening to them, but one that they can actively participate in. From there, I think our real responsibility sits with policymakers to actually engage with these issues again, not just to directly address technology company overreach, but to name and shape a positive vision of what a technological future looks like. Here in the United States, what is the American vision of an economy in 2035 that makes the very most of AI and protects workers and sustains our innovative capacity and makes sure that everybody participates in this economic cornucopia? And the third is, I think, the responsibility that sits on both private sector leaders and public sector community organizations. This can't be a discussion between regulators and actors without there also being participation from those who have the voices of the community at heart. Bring in stockholder perspectives, bring in corporate governance, but also bring in the vulnerability of those who are sitting at the front lines of hospitals that are deeply under-resourced, of farms where those who have access to AI tools are seeing increased yield, and those who don't have capital access will never be able to access AI tools. We need to ensure that those voices are in the conversation. And I think in many ways, Ramona, this is no longer a conversation about regulation. It really is a conversation about fundamentally what it means to be a part of the American social experiment, about what role we each individually have and what role our institutions have to protect us.
I think you're right about all of this. I do. I really do. I think you have a really good perspective on it. And when we've talked in the past, AI has been around for a while and it's doing some amazing things, and we don't want to stop that. It's also doing some fun things, and that's where the birds come in. Got to work into the birds. Uh, I I find it really good for someone like me. I'm an amateur birder. I'm someone who loves to watch it. I like to be out in nature. I started during COVID. It was a connection to the outdoors when you got stuck indoors all the time, right? I find there's some tools, Merlin, eBird, where AI is playing a really incredible role, not in just that for that amateur birder to understand, but migratory patterns and protection. What have you heard? What are you seeing out there?
Well, I want to start by honoring this piece around before we even get to AI. The fact that in many ways I feel like we've lost our connection to the natural world because of digital substitutes. I spent a lot of time with young people trying to understand kind of how shifts in technologies are changing social perspectives. And one of the things I'll often hear from young folks is I haven't really been on a nature walk or a trail walk, but I spent a lot of time inside of a video game world that had a ecosystem of forest greenery attached to it. And that statement's often given with almost no self-awareness about how absurd it is. So I want to start from this fact that whether it's birds or conservation, whether it's a connection to the natural environment, the song of the forest, there is a part of the human experience that goes back millions of years that we have very quickly displaced with the digital world. And we should be very cognizant of that. I come to that perspective through my work with indigenous peoples around the world who often will share with me how their view of the natural ecosystems they operate in inform how they think about technology. And if we don't bring that voice into the discourse, we've lost already. But on birds, because I love them, you mentioned a couple of tools that are out there that are doing something quite profound. They're changing our relationship with the natural world and with birds in particular. They're letting us do very basic things today, like, as you mentioned, being able to turn your phone on and have it listen with you, and as you highlight certain songs or sounds, to have a tool that tells you what that bird was so you can look for it. But think about the possibilities there as we think about the next 10 years. To move from just identification to potentially being able to monitor an entire forest, to understand migration patterns, to know where you might go to see a particular species, but also to know what natural resources it needs in order to foster its young and make sure it lives a good life. We're working with conservation groups around the world to do things like bioacoustic monitoring. It's a fancy way of saying we put up a lot of microphones in a forest so that we're always listening. And in doing so, we're able to do some really special things. One, understand what animals might be in the forest, but not just at the level of knowing there's a deer or an elk or a particular magpie, but to maybe even begin to identify individual animals by their sounds, to be able to track them through the forest, to see what they do in their lives, to vastly increase our knowledge of the natural order of ecosystems, to also make sure that we're able to conserve those species that are at risk, to know where vulnerable animals are and ensure that we're protecting them appropriately. This is the fun stuff that we're already definitely going to do. But if you want, Ramona, we can get a little bit more speculative.
I'd love to.
Well, this is the fun stuff. As we've learned that AI systems are able to understand human languages to translate between them, we've learned a lot about how languages work generally. And some really exciting work is being done on what would happen if we were able to collect millions of hours of things like whale song or the song of a particular bird species to understand and analyze whether there might be meaning hidden in that language that we just don't hear with the human ear, to actually understand how animals communicate with each other. And maybe if you take it one step further, how we might be able to communicate with them. I wonder what it might look like if we were to hear a raven or a crow, an incredibly intelligent bird who's communicating with its peers, to actually be able to communicate directly with them. What questions would we ask? How would we expand our imagination because of our relationship with birds?
I have heard this is the study naturalists have done with crows, that crows hold grudges. So my first question to a crow is going to be, what's got you pissed off? Why are you holding a grudge against me? What did I do wrong? I think that would be a remarkable thing to learn, and therefore I am all for AI trying to figure it out.
Well, I'm quite a hopeful person, Ramona, and I love that. Let's find out what makes a crow angry, but then let's also find out if a crow has a sense of humor, because I'd love to hear what kind of things makes a crow laugh.
They're probably laughing at us.
There you go.
Vilas, thank you so much for sitting down with me on Birds and Nerds.
It's always a joy, Ramona. Thank you so much.
That was my conversation with Vilas Dhar, president of Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, talking about AI, its ethical applications, and what we might learn from birds if we apply AI. I'm Ramona Schindelheim. Thank you for listening to the Birds and Nerds podcast.